Hello, this is Troy Harman, and I want to speak to you today about Robert E. Lee's reconnoitering of the Union left flank on July 2nd, 1863, second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the area of the Round Tops. And this is going to be a very educational program. I hope you enjoy it. They have a lot of visuals. And we're going to look at Lee's ordered reconnaissance, specifically through the scouting mission of his engineer, Captain Samuel R. Johnston, who led the specific reconnaissance. And our subtitle is going to be Clues to Why the South Lost the War at Gettysburg. That's a pretty big statement, but that'll make sense as we go along. Our focus is on the reconnaissance, though, and then we'll put it into big picture at the conclusion. All right, lost cause and sunrise attack. A central tenet of the South's lost cause apology, or defense, held to the belief the Confederacy lost the war at Gettysburg due to delays in attacking on all 3 days of the battle, especially on July 2nd, when assaults against the Federal left flank and left center began after 3:30 p.m., only 3 hours before sunset. Southern apologists, defenders, obsessed in the post-war years over the lost minutes that cost Lee's army the key positions of Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill. If you're new to the story, you may be thinking, how does lost cause get wrapped up in this reconnaissance? Well, lost cause was the post-war Southern spin on why they were fighting and why they lost. And they were very interested in how time was lost on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg and attacking the area of the Round Tops. And so that meant investigating everything, including the reconnaissance in the morning. Lost cause and sunrise attack. Northern newspapers inadvertently fueled this obsession by publishing Northern participant accounts affirming Little Round Top was unoccupied most of July 2nd and was only saved at the last minute by the quick reactions of Gouverneur Warren, Strong Vincent, and Joshua Chamberlain, and others who hastily defended the hill. Southern defenders, apologists, mostly blamed Major General James Longstreet for not attacking the Federal left earlier in the day. They claimed he deliberately disobeyed Lee's orders for a sunrise attack. Longstreet defended himself well enough in post-war writings that two camps emerged, one that blamed Longstreet for delays and one that exonerated him. The question on the minds of those who debated both sides of the issue was, who was most responsible for a series of delays and where were the critical moments lost? The credibility of Captain Samuel Johnston's sunrise reconnaissance on July 2nd, 1863 became central to this debate. Now, this is a synoptic study. This lecture will carefully reconstruct Johnston's fateful reconnaissance in his own words from letters written in the 1870s to 90s to Bishop George Peterkin, Major General Fitzhugh Lee, and Major General Lafayette McLaws. Because the precise route and mission of Johnston's reconnaissance have always been somewhat of a mystery, the task of reconstructing it has not been an easy one. The bigger barrier was preconceived notions that Johnston did not know where he was going or what he was doing. A synoptic study of Johnston's letters helps to clarify. So we're gonna cross compare all of the letters and glean excerpts and compare them back and forth to try to figure out the route that he took. Okay, and as we pluck out important excerpts from his letters, he said to Bishop George Peterkin, Johnston wrote, about 4 o'clock next morning, that's July 2nd, General Lee called me and directed that I go at once and make reconnaissance as far as practicable on the right. So that's what his orders were, as far as practicable on the right. That's how far the scouting mission was to go. Now, for those of you that know the battle well, you see that word practicable and it stands out. You think of it in a more famous order from Lee to Ewell on the first day, where he told him to seize the heights south of town if practicable without bringing on a general engagement. Lee used it more than once in the Gettysburg campaign. General Meade, the commanding Union general, used it at least twice too. But what it does is it's a command style to use the word practicable. It means the person on the ground knows better than you do because they're there and you trust them to make that decision. This is a view from Western McPherson Ridge looking west towards the Wembley property or the Hare property. You can see what is today Hare Ridge Tavern and Hurricanes. That's the Chambersburg Pike in the foreground. And Johnston would have headed west after meeting with Lee near the seminary, most likely along this road, although there were a couple of lesser known parallel roads like Old Mill Road. But he would have gone with Johnston after he left Lee back to the area of Hare Ridge. Why, on the other side of those two buildings, on the reverse slope there of Hare Ridge, is where McLaws' division was and Hood's division, the two divisions of Longstreet's corps that depended on Johnston's reconnaissance to get to the area of the Round Tops. So he was going to start his reconnaissance from their location. Techniques. As we continue this synoptic study, Johnston wrote to Lafayette McLaws, a division commander in Longstreet's corps, "I did not have the escort of 200 men, which you, McLaws, say was detailed from your command to go with me. I have only 3 or 4 men. I had been told by General Lee that while in Mexico, he found he could get nearer the enemy and do more with a few men than with many." Techniques continued. "I had been told by General Lee that while in Mexico, he found he could get nearer the enemy and do more with a few men than with many. I found that to be true in every instance in my large experience during the 3 years that I was with General Lee as a reconnoitering officer." Now, what does he mean by this? Well, if the scouting mission led by Johnston on behalf of Lee towards the Round Tops had included 200 men, well, they would have stirred up enough dust that would have been seen at the Round Top signal station miles away. They would give away where they were and endanger their own existence. So traveling in small groups allows you to be less conspicuous. You can break, if you only have 4 or 5 men, you can break up and take different paths and then regroup on the other side, find different routes for troops to follow and so on. You can take cover from the signal station on Little Round Top by just hiding under the cover of trees. You can do that with a few men, and you can get really, really close that way. You might even be standing right next to a Union officer and he not even know it if you go in with small groups. Techniques continued. Johnston gives another technique away in his scouting mission. "I saw 3 or 4 troopers moving slowly and very cautiously in the direction of Gettysburg. I had to let them get out of sight before crossing the Emmitsburg Road so as to see and not be seen is what was required of a reconnoitering officer." That's the key when you're scouting, is to see your enemy without him knowing that you see him. And that requires sometimes putting on a straw hat instead of an official army hat. It means covering shiny buttons that might reflect a mile away and be seen on a signal station like Little Round Top. It means it means dismounting at times. It means taking stars and bars or epaulets off your shoulders so that you're not conspicuous, so that you can get near and you can see without being seen. Who was Samuel R. Johnston? He conducted the reconnaissance at Savage Station, Malvern Hill, Groveton, Manassas, Antietam, and Chancellorsville, all before Gettysburg. He served on Lee's staff and was detached to Longstreet throughout the war, being promoted to major on March 17, 1864, and lieutenant colonel on September 15, 1864. Major General Jeb Stuart, the cavalry chieftain on the southern side, recommended Johnston to Lee, stating that, quote, "He possesses remarkable qualifications for the post of military engineer. His recommendations are very high. I respectfully submit this special request on behalf of one of Virginia's worthiest sons. He is sober, untiring, and capable." And so Johnston came highly recommended by Jeb Stuart to Lee as his scout. Continuing on with a biography of Johnston, he was 6.5 feet tall with dark complexion, hazel eyes, and dark hair. Brigadier General Walter Stevens, post-war superintendent and engineer of the Mexican Imperial Railroad, wrote that Johnston, quote, "has no superior as constructing and locating engineer," unquote. And what that means is that when he was laying railroads in 1864 in Georgia, he could determine the best terrain for where the railroad should go to connect cities and to connect depots, to be along water station sources. He was excellent at seeing that before it was even designed. He lived in 13 states post-war. After 1888, he seemingly lived out his days in East Orange, New Jersey. One of the reasons he would have lived in so many states after the war is that engineers were in great demand after the Civil War during the Second Industrial Revolution. So he found work in multiple locations. Along with him was Major John J. Graham Clarke. He was a scout sent by James Longstreet, the lieutenant general, whose troops depended on the reconnaissance to know how to attack the area of the Round Tops and the Peach Orchard, the Devil's Den, and the Wheat Field, as we now call them all today. Clarke then was Longstreet's man to be sent with Johnston to be part of that reconnoitering party. Who was Clarke? Clarke surveyed the Richmond and York River Railroad before the war. He aided in construction of Fort Drury below Richmond in May of '62. He was a post-war city engineer in Manchester, Virginia, and a bridge builder in Baltimore. Quote, he was a very handsome man, tall, well-formed, of commanding appearance, and few people would pass him without turning around again to look at him. He was killed in Paterson, New Jersey in a bizarre train accident. He's buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. Now, Johnston would write to McLaws that he only had 3 or 4 other people with him, so that would be a maximum party of 5. We know only one other name in that group, and that was a major of artillery, and his name was John Cheeves Haskell from South Carolina, and he was part of Henry's battalion. And so that was important to have an artillery person with you on a ride like this to determine where the artillery could set up to attack the positions that you were going to check out in such a scouting mission. Okay, maps. They had maps with them, and as we do this synoptic study, and I'm plucking out quotes from letters written across a span of time after the war by Johnston, we've got a good insight here into how maps were used. Johnston wrote to Lafayette McLaws, quote, the 3, James Longstreet, Robert E. Lee, and Ambrose Powell Hill, were holding a map. General Lee was talking and pointing on the map. I sketched the route over which I had reconnoitered. I'm sort of jumping ahead in the chronology here to when Johnston returned from his reconnaissance. He leaned over Lee's shoulder near the seminary and pointed out the route that he had taken. And he was doing so with a map that Lee had in his possession. So let's talk a little bit about that map. Okay, it's over on the left side of your screen. This is the map most likely that Lee was holding, that Johnston leaned over his shoulder and traced on. This is the Jedediah Hotchkiss map. And if you take a look at my other presentation on Lee reconnoitering at Gettysburg, it's on the Culp's Hill area. And you'll find that video lecture at this same site. But I have this map in much more vivid detail. But it shows Hotchkiss's drawing for the Confederate forces through the first day of the battle and into the early afternoon of the second day of the battle. You can see troop placements north of town, west of town, and even to the east of town. Notice, though, that in the lower left-hand corner of this map, where you see the crossroads, that's the famous Peach Orchard area that was so integral to the second day's fighting. You can see there's no markings on that end of the map. That's why Johnston was being sent on a scouting mission, was to fill in all the details on the lower left-hand corner of your map to determine where the Federal troops were, where the Confederate artillery could be placed, where the infantry should be positioned, and so on. This is the broader Hotchkiss map put together over several weeks in February of 1863. Jedediah Hotchkiss was sent to Pennsylvania in utmost secrecy to collect county maps from courthouses all over South Central Pennsylvania, and then piece together a map that includes parts of 3 states, Virginia at the bottom, Maryland at the midsection and off to your right lower hand corner. And then the upper part of the map is all Pennsylvania with Gettysburg centrally located there. So Lee had a broad campaign map. This is the close-up of the Hotchkiss map of the Gettysburg area. So Lee could see the creeks, and he could see the railroad, and he could see the roads and so forth. He had surnames on the map with an accompanying chart identifying some of the surnames as sympathetic to the South. They would be willing to give away information about troop movements of Union forces that might have passed through. It also would provide food. Hotchkiss thoroughly scouted South Central Pennsylvania 5 months before the battle. Okay, let's move on from maps now to what kind of reconnaissance did Lee want Johnston to do? Was it a route reconnaissance or an area reconnaissance? For people that are really interested in the specifics of Gettysburg, this is important. Route would be roads that Longstreet should take. Area is the topography, the surrounding country, and the Union position. Which one? Well, we start to get clues in a letter from Johnston to Lafayette McLaws as we continue our synoptic study. Johnston wrote to McLaws, he, Lee, said nothing about finding a route over which troops should be moved and unobserved by the enemy. But it was not necessary, as that was part of my duty as a reconnoitering officer and would be attended to without special instruction. This is important that Lee didn't have to say, I want you to find the route for which Longstreet's corps and his artillery should move by. You know, McLaws' division, Hood's division, Alexander's artillery. He didn't have to say that. McLaws said he understood that that would be attended to, that was part of my duty. So Lee wasn't the sort of person that would micromanage. He trusted you to do what you had been hired to do. Johnston wrote to Lafayette McLaws as we do this synoptic study. Indeed, he said, that is, Lee said nothing about the movement of troops at all and left me with only that knowledge of what he wanted, which I had obtained after long service with him. And that was, he wanted me to consider every contingency which might arise. Now, that would include route reconnaissance, that's area reconnaissance, that's every contingency. So think of Johnston as a sponge soaking up everything and giving that information back to Lee. Okay, route reconnaissance. McLaws received these words from Johnston. Finding a route was part of my duty and would be attended to. Okay, what routes were found? Well, as we look at this map, you can see M for McLaws and H for Hood. And this is how it worked out initially for the 2 divisions in their march to try to find the Union left to attack it, based on Johnston's reconnaissance. Hood, you can see him there on Hare Ridge, or he would have been slightly west of it to use the ridge to conceal him from Little Round Top to his right, to the right of your screen. And McLaws went around Black Horse Tavern and then had to stop on a troublesome hill. That troublesome hill there was in full view of the Union signal station, and McLaws had to stop and wait for Longstreet to come forward and give further instructions on how to adjust their movements not to be seen by the signal station. So McLaws had to double back and follow Hood. Well, that's debatable. He might have led Hood for a while, but anyway, both of them ended up taking the same route out of your screen, much further to your right on a road known as Willoughby Road Run. But the way that Johnston first scouted it out, he would have had his 4 or 5 men separate and find these routes and then unite somewhere south of there. He would have had McLaws go to your left or to the west, and he would have had Hood go to your right to the east, and they would have moved on parallel tracks. And the reason for parallel tracks is to cut down on the long traffic jam line that would certainly occur if they were all on the same road. McLaws misinterprets Johnson. We see Lafayette McLaws writing in fragments of a Gettysburg paper that's in Duke University and now at Gettysburg National Military Park Archives. He, writes McLaws, he, Johnston, seems not to realize that he was conducting my column, for he was the only one who was supposed to know or could know the route to take. He, that's Johnston, denies that General Lee or anyone else said anything to him about finding a route to go on to the left, which would be invisible to the enemy. And yet, when I was following this route that he must have designated on the paper, and he tells me, and he tells General Longstreet, without being asked, that by that route my movement would be disclosed to the enemy. Now, what we're walking into here is a post-war argument that it's a tangent and really don't have time to get into it. Some of you know it really well. But you have to be aware of this when you're doing synoptic studies and plucking out excerpts of letters, that you're walking into a post-war argument. McLaws and Longstreet didn't get along well. They disagreed at Gettysburg. They disagreed in the Knoxville campaign later that year. Longstreet, in late December of 1863, wrote the Inspector General of the Confederacy in Richmond. And the letter found its way to Confederate President Jefferson Davis's desk, recommending that McLaws be transferred from his corps. And McLaws learned about this and wrote a letter also to the Inspector General in Richmond saying, you can't remove me without a court-martial. I demand a court-martial. Well, Jefferson Davis got involved and said, well, go ahead and start the court-martial procedures, so he can exonerate his name. And it was a lengthy thing. It went on most of the winter and into the spring. And early May of 1864, McLaws was eventually exonerated. It was declared in some ways kind of a mistrial in the end, and McLaws was able to come back and legally and rejoin his troops, but he ended up spending time in other parts of the South, opposing General Sherman in the final days of the war in North Carolina. But this disagreement that they had, which was ongoing, it went on, again, it's a story unto itself. It went on for years, manifested itself in post-war letters. And McLaws was trying to exonerate his name in the post-war years for the historical record. And the best way he knew how to do that was to write everyone involved in the Gettysburg campaign pertaining to Longstreet's march to attack the Round Tops. Longstreet was alleged to have lost valuable time in that march. Johnston's name surfaced as the person who did the original reconnaissance. Naturally, McLaws would want to pick his brain and find out what Johnston did or didn't do. So McLaws really misinterprets Johnston, giving the impression that Johnston had a misleading map, and that Johnston didn't find a route, when we saw from the previous slide that Johnston did find a route. Okay, here's another interesting map related to the route that the artillery would have followed to attack the area of the Round Tops, first scouted by Johnston in the morning. Johnston wrote to Fitz Lee in 1878, quote, "We were very successful, and after examining the roads over which our troops would have to move in the event of a movement on the enemy's left." Now, quite clearly, Johnston tells Fitzhugh Lee that he examined the roads over which the troops would have to move. So let's use that statement to talk about the route the artillery took. Now, this is one of the more intriguing aspects of what's come to be known as the Longstreet countermarch. Countermarch meaning that the Confederates thought they were spotted by the Little Round Top signal station. McLaws in particular had to stop for fear of being on a position where his troop position would be revealed. So he had to turn around, and it's figured that Longstreet maybe lost an hour and a half turning around. Why is all this important? I don't want to get ahead of myself, but so you'll see the relevancy of all this. after the war, Southerners maintained in the lost cause that Longstreet lost the Civil War at Gettysburg. And one of the reasons was he lost time getting into position to attack the Union left where the Round Tops are, that had he saved any time, he would have been able to take Little Round Top unoccupied. So, I mean, all of these movements, Johnston's reconnaissance, the backtracking of the march to get into position to attack, all of that was put under a microscope after the war, including the artillery. Now, Edward Porter Alexander was jurisdictionally given Longstreet's corps artillery, and he wrote about this in a book called Fighting for the Confederacy After the War, where he said that he had no problems getting from point A to point B. That is, getting from the area of Marsh Creek, Black Horse Tavern area, just west of Gettysburg, 3 miles west of Gettysburg. He had no trouble getting from there to Warfield Ridge for his artillery to open up fire against the Peach Orchard and begin the attack all into the valley below the Round Tops. He had no trouble getting there. I mean, it was just lickety-split, very quick. He said he was in his artillery trains so quickly traversed the ground to get into position that he was able to just leisurely ride back to see how the infantry was doing in their march. And he found the columns under McLaws halted on what he called the Troublesome Hill that exposed them to the signal station on Little Round Top to the east. And he walked over, and there was an argument going on between McLaws and Longstreet. We know that from other accounts, about what to do and how to circumvent this hill without being further exposed to enemy view. And Alexander said he sort of stood in the background, and he said, I talked to an officer and I told him, why don't they take the route I took? He said, I didn't have any trouble. I'm already in position. You know, my 40 plus artillery pieces and all the ammunition trains, we didn't have any trouble. We're there. We weren't seen by the signal station. And why don't they take the route I took? Well, the reason most likely Alexander never mentioned that officer's name is because of what I've already alluded to already, and that is the lost cause. If he had dropped his name, that officer's name, Alexander would have been putting a target on that man's back. He would have been entangled suddenly in the controversy of why Longstreet didn't attack the area of the Round Tops earlier in the day. So the officer he spoke to, Alexander, keeps his name anonymous. But that still leaves us the question of what route did Alexander take? And the traditional view is I've marked in red. That is, he moved south from Black Horse Tavern along Black Horse Tavern Road, then turned slightly west on Plank Road, went around the Troublesome Hill. You can see the 3 sides of a square. That's him going around the Troublesome Hill, so he's not seen by the signal station at Little Round Top to your right of the screen, really out of the view of your screen. And then where you see the A, that's where the traditional view says that he re-accessed Black Horse Tavern Road, and then he went south and made his way over to Warfield Ridge opposite the Peach Orchard. Harry Fons advanced that view in a book called Gettysburg, The Second Day. It's an outstanding book, one of the best books I've ever read, and he may very well have been right that that's the route that Alexander took. But I have respectfully an alternative view, and it is I believe the route that Alexander's artillery guns took was more directly south, as I've marked in blue pen. I believe that he followed the Marsh Creek. And the reason for that is that if you have 4 to 6 horses per artillery piece, and there were 40 artillery pieces at least, really upwards of 60 before they were done. But just go with the conservative number 40 and times that by 4 to 6 horses. Each one can drink 10 to 15 gallons of water a day. Plus, you need barrels and barrels of water so you can sponge the cannons between each round of fire to put out old embers before putting in a fresh powder charge to fire the artillery. Because you need that in an artillery duel, you need water. And so the horse-drawn artillery and ammunition wagons, it would have been more efficient for them to follow Marsh Creek. They would have crossed at Brames Mill, forded the creek there, and then followed along the embankments on the west side of Marsh Creek. Gettysburg Campground is there today. And they would have made their way down across Pumping Station Road, and I believe that they crossed Sachs Bridge. Okay, and we'll get into that as we go along. Okay, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander's artillery battalion followed one of these two routes that Johnston reconnoitered. Notice I have the blue route. This more specifically shows you what I was just talking about. The blue route with the blue arrows is the route that I believe personally that Alexander's artillery trains took. See them crossing at the sawmill there, from Black Horse Tavern Road to Plank Road to a road along the western side of Marsh Creek. And then they would have crossed the covered bridge known as Sachs Bridge or Sachs Bridge. And that's how they would have accessed Warfield Ridge to prepare for the attack to the valley in front of the Round Tops. This is Hare Ridge looking west. From Hare Ridge looking west along the Fairfield Road to the Black Horse Tavern immediately below. This road was central to Johnston's route reconnaissance. Okay, now Johnston gives us more clues into the route that he took in his reconnaissance on behalf of Lee that morning. He wrote, quote, following along that ridge in the direction of the Round Top across the Emmitsburg Road. And so in blue, I've marked the route that Johnston would have taken. The Emmitsburg Road is on a ridge line, and so we call it the Emmitsburg Road Ridge. Sometimes it's called the Peach Orchard Ridge. But it makes sense that once he got across Sachs Bridge, he would have moved behind the cover of the ridge so he wouldn't be in view of Round Top. And then he would have followed Ridge Road. Ridge Road runs along the southern side of the Round Tops and then cuts through between Warfield Ridge, Big Round Top. You can actually see Round Top in the upper part of your screen. This is the route that I believe that he took. He said following along that ridge. Well, that's the Emmitsburg Road Ridge. That's ultimately the ridge where Hood's division and McLaws' division would be placed at right angles to make their attack. Johnston either forded or crossed a small bridge at Willoughby Run, north of the Pitzer Schoolhouse, and likely crossed Sachs Bridge east of it. He then rode behind the Confederate pickets or guards who were stationed in unison with the map's red lines. Okay, what I want you to see here, you can see way off to the left, it says Covered Bridge. All right, this is where Johnston's reconnaissance crossed the bridge that I believe later Edward Porter Alexander's artillery would cross. And then towards the upper part of your screen in the middle, you can see a red arrow. His party most likely split up, and one of the members of that 4 or 5 man party, maybe Major Clarke, perhaps John Cheeves Haskell, would have taken this other route so that the infantry and the artillery would have different routes to maneuver on, and the scouting mission would help find all these various routes and then unite on the other side. But notice at the bottom I wrote, he then rode behind Confederate pickets or guards who were stationed in unison with the map's red lines. Those are Confederate pickets. We know that parts of Scales, North Carolina Brigade were there. Down in the lower part of your screen, in the upper part of your screen where it's red, would have been Wilcox's Alabamians later in the morning. So he maneuvered behind the picket lines. The picket lines involved skirmishing. And as we continue the synoptics, notice Johnston wrote to Fitz Lee in 1878, quote, I left headquarters, that would be the seminary where Lee was, about sunrise, say 4 o'clock. I had to ride about 4 miles. Well, it's about 4 miles from the seminary to Little Round Top if you take that whole route and divide and take the various parallel roads. He writes, more than half this distance was covered by our pickets. So that last map showed you the pickets. The pickets were on the ridge that he was using for cover and concealment. He said he followed the ridge. It's pretty straightforward. He said more than half this distance was covered by our pickets. The remaining required a good deal of caution. So they were behind, was the reconnaissance party, behind the pickets. More than half this distance was covered by our pickets. The remaining required a good deal of caution. Now, we asked early on whether this was a route reconnaissance or an area reconnaissance. We said routes are looking for roads that get you from point A to point B, so the infantry and the artillery could be efficient in their movements to attack the area of the round tops. But we also left open for the possibility that it was also an area reconnaissance. And that involves looking at the topography. You know, every contingency, Johnston said, Lee told me to look for. And it was understood that he would look for every contingency. Topography. A few minutes later, General Longstreet and Hill moved off. I then took a seat beside General Lee, and we talked of the topographical features of the country. Now, again, we're addressing this a little bit out of chronology. This is a statement representing Johnston returning to the seminary and talking to Lee and pointing to the Hotchkiss map over his shoulder and tracing the route that he had taken. He said that after that meeting, this is around 8 o'clock, between 7 and 8 o'clock, Lee just sat down with Johnston and they talked about the topographical features of the country. So that tells us plainly that it was an area reconnaissance as well as a scouting reconnaissance. Now, from the official report, Longstreet's report, it states McLaws' division, however, reached Marsh Creek, 4 miles from Gettysburg, a little after dark, and Hood's division got within nearly the same distance of the town about 12 o'clock at night. The point is, the topography would involve discussion of where the water was for artillery to proceed so that they could have their water supply for their horses and for sponging. It also involves the ridge lines that would be used for artillery. Samuel Johnston had done that in other battles. He had helped, in fact, Johnston had helped scout the area of Marye's Heights at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862 for artillery placement. So Johnston would have discussed the ridge lines. He would have talked about Little Round Top. He would have talked about everything that engineers think to talk about to one another. Lee would have been considered the best engineer in the country before the Civil War. That is a prerequisite to being made superintendent at West Point, which Lee was in the 1850s. So this would have been a very cerebral discussion about the topography, which is part of the area reconnaissance Johnston did for Lee. Longstreet's report said McLaws' division, however, reached Marsh Creek. So that gives us an idea of where Johnston would have had to start the reconnaissance from. If McLaws' division was encamped along Marsh Creek before they began their march towards the Round Tops, based on the scouting done by Johnston and the maps he provided, if that's the case, then that means Johnston had to start his route along Marsh Creek. There's another view of Marsh Creek from the Gettysburg campground. That's the west side of Marsh Creek, the route that Alexander's artillery likely followed to Sachs Bridge to cross it further south. McLaws and Hood's division eventually diverted to Willoughby Run Road, and they would have followed along Willoughby Run. That would have also helped the soldiers fill up their canteens en route to the attack in front of the Round Tops. Johnston wrote to Lafayette McLaws, I crossed the creek on the same bridge that he, Longstreet, did, and turned to the left at once and got to the Warfield Ridge where you, McLaws, subsequently formed your line. And the only bridge that that's in the area was Sachs Bridge. There would have been any need to cross a bridge along Willoughby Run. You could just easily ford that. It was a very small stream. But the only place where you would need a bridge to cross a body of water would be across Marsh Creek, and the only such bridge to do so would be Sachs Bridge. So through basic reasoning, we can presume that Johnston followed along the western banks, that would be to the right of your screen, the western banks, the route that Alexander's artillery would later follow, and follow along the banks of Marsh Creek, and then he turned and crossed Sachs Bridge. And Sachs Bridge would have led him across the area today of the Eisenhower Farm to the top of Warfield Ridge, where the artillery would eventually be placed. McLaws misinterprets Johnston. In fragments of a Gettysburg paper, McLaws wrote, "My command did not cross any creek on a bridge." Now, I'm going to go ahead and read this quote, and then I'll address McLaws' charge. Johnston wrote to McLaws, "I recrossed the bridge and took the most direct route regardless of fences to where I had left General Lee." All right, this is two references that Johnston made to a bridge. McLaws said, "I didn't cross any bridge. My command didn't cross a bridge." And where he misinterpreted Johnston is Johnston was saying Longstreet's command crossed that bridge. And I've already discussed this earlier. I don't want to be redundant. That's a reference to Edward Porter Alexander crossing that bridge. McLaws misinterpreted it to think he specifically was being labeled as having crossed the bridge. More broadly, Johnston was saying some part of Longstreet's command crossed that bridge, and that was Edward Porter Alexander's artillery. He wrote to Lafayette McLaws, Johnston did, following along that ridge in the direction of Round Top, across the Emmitsburg Road. Well, you know, for people that would suggest we can't possibly know the route that Johnston took, they can't have done the synoptic study. If you read the letters, he's quite clear as Johnston the route that he took. You can see the Emmitsburg Road. You can see Ridge Road. He said he followed along that ridge. Why would he do that? Follow along the ridge because you're behind the pickets, which protect you, and you are also behind the ridge, so you won't be seen by the signal station, Little Round Top, and it leads to Little Round Top to follow that ridge. And he quite clearly said that he followed along that ridge in the direction of the Round Top and that he crossed the Emmitsburg Road. He's quite clear on where he went. All right, notice the pass through Warfield Ridge at the J. Beamer farmhouse. It's an important mark that I've made with the little blue arrows to show you how Johnston would have slipped around Warfield Ridge, through Warfield Ridge, to Bushman Hill. The forward blue arrows pointing to Bushman Hill, and then beyond that is Big Round Top. To Lafayette McLaws, Johnston wrote, then rode, that means they were on horseback, was this scouting party of 4 or 5 men, then rode along the base of Round Top to beyond the ground that was occupied by General Hood, and where there was later on a cavalry fight. Well, this is quite clear on where they went. Now, you're looking at the right flank marker of the Army of Northern Virginia, and that's along Warfield Ridge, and below and off to the right, sort of out of your view to the right, is Bushman Hill. And then along that tree line there, that's the southern base of Big Round Top. And you can see along the edge of the tree line, you can't see it so well here, but there's a stone wall there, and there's a trail there known as Bushman Lane. And that's the route that Farnsworth's cavalry entered in on the 3rd day of the battle to flush Confederates out away from the Round Tops after Pickett's charge, to try to force the Confederates to break contact and fall back towards Warfield Ridge. And quite clearly, Johnston's telling you where he was based on your knowledge of the battle. He said he rode along the base of Round Top. Well, there's Big Round Top in the background of your picture, to beyond the ground that was occupied by General Hood. Well, General Hood's attack of Little Round Top, Devil's Den, you were talking about Alabama and Texas troops and Georgia troops. He said he went beyond that ground. So that means he went over Big Round Top. And he said where later on there was a cavalry fight. Well, that's the fight of the famous Farnsworth Charge. And if you walk into the woods that we saw in the background of the last slide, you find these cavalry markers. Again, he's quite clear as to where his reconnaissance was. He says where there was later on a cavalry fight. And these markers all up inside the woods of Big Round Top tell you where the cavalry fight was. Where there was later on a cavalry fight. And you can see the Wells statue there. And the 1st Vermont would have come through here. The 5th New York. And where there was later on a cavalry fight. This is D Field. It was marked as in a sequence of A, B, C, D as the letter D on a map put together by a cavalryman named Parsons after the war to mark the route that Farnsworth's charge took. And that's the marker for the 1st Vermont Cavalry. And though there's some debate as to exactly where Farnsworth was killed on the 3rd day while flushing Alabama and Texas troops out of the Valley of Death, that's the traditional spot there in D Field on the western slopes of Big Round Top. And quite clearly, Johnston said he crossed the ground where there was later on a cavalry fight. And he said, and I got up on the Round Tops. He said, I got up on the slopes of Round Top where I had a commanding view. And there's Big Round Top in the background, Little Round Top in the foreground. And you can see some people standing on a very large rock or sitting there. And that's the view that he would have had. He was able to look down on the Union perspective down below. And I'm going to read to you an account of someone else that was up there that sort of cross-references this whole thing. This is, I mentioned him earlier, John Chiefs Haskell of Henry's Battalion. He was a major, and he was with the scouting party of Samuel Johnston's to find the area of the Round Tops in preparation for Longstreet's attack. He wrote, sometime earlier, I, with several couriers, and one of our officers had ridden over the top of Round Top, finding only an enemy picket of 2 or 3 men, one of whom we captured. No body of the enemy was then in sight. Now, why was John Chiefs Haskell with them on this reconnaissance? It would have been to help them determine in artillery distances. So he would know distances from Warfield Ridge, where his artillery would have to set up. And so he could see that, of course, but he could then move out and see where the Union artillery positions would likely be. And he could gauge distances and look at the ground that the Union would occupy and determine where they might post artillery. Very important that John Chiefs Haskell was on this scouting mission. So Haskell said they got to the top of Round Top, and so does Johnston to Lafayette McLaws. He said where he had a commanding view. He wrote to George Peterkin, the bishop, did Johnston, quote, when I got to the extreme right of our reconnaissance on the Little Round Top, General Lee turned and looking at me said, did you get there? I assured him that I did. He said to General Longstreet, I think you had better move on. We can see Little Round Top to the front left and Big Round Top off to the right. We've jumped out of chronology a little bit to read this quote in our synoptic study. This is a moment in time. This quote is from a moment of time when Johnston had returned from his reconnaissance, leaned over Lee's shoulder, traced on the Hotchkiss map where he had been. He would write to Fitz Lee with Johnston, I suppose that General Lee's object in sending me with General Longstreet was that I should give him the benefit of information that I had obtained by reconnaissance I had made of the country, and the position of the enemy. This is a specific reference by Johnston to Fitz Lee of accompanying the Longstreet March in the afternoon to attack the area in front of the Round Tops. And what Johnston is saying is that I was assigned to this march so that I would be of benefit with the information I had gained by the morning reconnaissance. But what I want you to see, and I've marked this in red, is the information that I had obtained by reconnaissance I had made of the country. There's your area reconnaissance. There's your topography. I had made of the country and the position of the enemy. Oh my goodness. This is a powerful word. And the position of the enemy. What Johnston is telling us is that he saw the Union Third Corps. He saw them. The position of the enemy. Reconnaissance I had made of the country and position of the enemy. Okay, we're looking at a Phil Lano map on the possible position of the Third Corps on the morning of July 2nd. This would have been their original deployment before they moved out, at least with a portion of their troops, to the Emmitsburg Road. The original location of the Third Corps, when Johnston got there, maybe around 5:30 a.m., and climbed along the south side of Little Round Top to Vincent Spur and looked down on them. Birney's division would have been in the area of the wheat field, directly below him. Some of Buford's cavalry would have been directly below him too, along the Wheatville Road at Plum Run, taking advantage of the water source there. And further north would have been A.A. Humphrey's division encamped all around the Abram Trossel farm, and north of that into a place called Cadore Thicket. That's out in front of where the Pennsylvania Memorial is today. Not quite that far north, but down in the low culvert or low valley there. Now, those Third Corps troops at 5:30 in the morning were not in a battle formation. They were actually bivouacked or encamped, and there would have been campfires. What Johnston and his scouting party of Clarke and Haskell and one or two other people who were not mentioned, what they would have heard, they would have heard the coughing of troops. They would have smelled the wood smoke of the campfires. They would have heard the of the horses. And they would have, at 5:30 a.m., about an hour and 15 minutes after sunup, been able to look down on an encamped, bivouacked Third Corps. This was important information because it showed that the Third Corps was not in a position at that point. They were not ready to fight. And it would greatly influence Robert E. Lee's plan for the second day. He believed that if Longstreet had made the attack when these Federal troops were encamped, that it would be very similar to Chancellorsville, and that the Confederates would be able to hit Federal troops unaware, encamped, and then roll them up towards Cemetery Ridge and Hill to the north. Generally believed that from this scouting report, the Union line could be rolled up without them having any advance notice the attack was coming. So Johnston was able to look down onto these campfires and to see the Union didn't really have a position at 5:30 in the morning. Ready to oppose. The line was formed ready to advance when we saw a body of troops forming in the peach orchard to resist our movement. That was the first evidence of any force being ready to oppose us on the enemy's left that I had seen during the day. The key words are being ready to oppose us. These words tell us, if we invert their meaning, that Johnston saw troops earlier in the day, but they were not ready to oppose. That goes back to the encampment explanation that I gave a few minutes ago. So herein, in this statement, being ready to oppose us, that's a reference to the 4 o'clock resistance of the Union at the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, the Devil's Den, and the Round Top. The Union were ready to oppose then. They had a position. They were ready to fight. Not when Johnston saw them earlier in the morning around 5:30 a.m. McLaws misinterprets Johnson. McLaws, in fragments of a Gettysburg paper, misinterpreted Johnson. Again, Johnston, tells us about troops forming in the peach orchard to oppose us, which were the first he had seen. The Federal reports proved that Sickles' troops had been on the ground about the peach orchard for hours. Now, McLaws misinterpreted Johnston's letter and his reconnaissance for generations by misquoting Johnston. Johnston never said that the Federal troops in the peach orchard at 4 o'clock were the first that he had seen. What he was saying is it was the first troops ready to oppose that he had seen. He saw Sickles' Third Corps in front of the Round Tops encamped at 5:30 in the morning. What was different at 4 p.m. was those troops were no longer encamped. They were in a position along the Peach Orchard Ridge or the Emmitsburg Road Ridge, and then at right angles to that through the wheat field back to Devil's Den and to Little Round Top. Summary conclusion. In summary, Johnston performed his duties well. He conducted both a route and area reconnaissance that included an examination of the Union position. We can logically cross-reference his whereabouts based on where the Union Third Corps rested and where Buford's 6th and 9th New York Cavalry picketed during Johnston's morning reconnaissance. Had Johnston taken another route, Buford's cavalry and Sickles' infantry would have discovered them. We can also cross-reference Johnston's whereabouts based on the routes that Hood, McLaws, and Alexander followed, and the position they established along Warfield Ridge, precisely opposite the Third Corps position around the Peach Orchard. Alexander, in particular, arrived at Warfield Ridge 30 minutes before Confederate infantry and knew precisely where to place his 40 to 60 artillery pieces, which would suggest that Johnston gave special attention to the artillery reconnaissance as he had at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. At both battles, he helped to sight the guns. The greater point is that when two Civil War armies established positions a mile apart, such as the ones along Cemetery and Seminary Ridges, it was understood the middle ground had to be contested, or that ground would be conceded to the enemy. It was given that one side or the other would fill the vacuum between the positions as far as practicable. To this point, Johnston discovered only cavalry along the Emmitsburg Road and no further resistance on the way to Little Round Top. The opportunity for a favorable outcome to the battle existed in the immediate hours after Johnston's reconnaissance before the Federal 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 12th Corps advanced to fill the empty spaces, which they did by 4 p.m. That is why Lee said to Longstreet, "I think you had better move on." Thank you for listening. That's General Lee's reconnaissance of the Union left to the area of the Round Tops on July 2nd, 1863, through his engineer and staff officer, Captain Samuel Johnston.